next talk is a talk by Martin Albrecht and Rikke Bjerg Jensen. Originally both from Royal Holloway, and now to King's.
Not because of me.
One actually one.
Okay, shots fired.
And they started to look into how we define security and if this is actually meaningful, if I understand correctly, or if it fits the point.
Let's say yes.
I think we will verify and we challenge how we define security.
So, hi everyone, thanks for having us. We need to start this talk with a content warning. So we use examples from Rike's fieldwork, who is an ethnographer, Martin, an ethnographer, and these examples concern questions. Okay, first I'm going to give you some motivation for what we're doing, as already alluded to by Andy. We highly recommend you read Jean-François Blanchet's book, Firms of Proof. And I'm going to read out a quote from this book, which says, Goldreich has argued cryptographic practice proceeds through the identification, conceptualization, and rigorous definition of cryptographic paths, which capture national security concerns. But how does one identify such national security concerns? On these questions is shown on this slide. For those of you who don't know who Goldreich is, who's mentioned here, that's what I know Goldreich. He's one of the founding figures in our field. Right? So the critique of Jean-François Blanchet is to say, like, okay, you have your rigorous definitions, but where do they come from? Right? The games, your cryptographer, or the functionalities that seem to fall from this guy. And so we respond to that critique by using ethnographic findings, by introducing ethnography into cryptography, and in particular, based on ethnographic findings, we initiate the study of what we call anti-compromise security. And that will be the rest of this talk. And I assume a large part of this audience doesn't know what ethnography is, so here is a definition. Ethnography is the study of people in natural operating settings or fields by means of methods to capture their social meanings and order activities. And maybe we'll talk a lot more about this because it's actually quite. So we're going to talk you through the setting, our research design, our findings, that will be the part by Rikke, and then I'll come back in and talk to you about the security notion, and then
Thank you. Yeah, so as we kick off, as Martin said, I'm an ethnographer, so I get to talk about the setting, the ethnographic setting, and what we mean by that. Maybe, oh, there we go. So my eyesight is a bit shit, so I kind of have to move between these two screens. So there will be some quotes that I'm going to talk about, findings of the work, the ethnographic work that I will read out. Might not read out all of them, but let's see how we get on with time as well. So the setting in particular, the anti-finance bill protests that took place in Kenya started on the 18th of June in 2024 and lasted until the 8th of August 2024, and roughly took place every Tuesday and Thursday, dubbed protest days during this period. And what it was sparked by was the finance bill that would raise taxes on essential goods, and these were goods that were already unaffordable for many, especially in the informal settlements, in the slums that they couldn't afford, such as whether it was sanitary towels or milk or whatever it might be, and that sparked these massive protests that were unprecedented in the context of Kenya, which I'll say a little bit about in a second. But one thing that was also very specific or different, I guess, about these protests was that it was the first time that it wasn't just the poor, the informal, those living in informal settlements that went to the street and protested the elite, so to speak, but this was also the middle classes, the working classes coming together, and therefore it was seen as a particular threat to the establishment, because suddenly you had doctors, you had lawyers, you had kind of middle classes also joining forces and going to the street to protest. So it was unprecedented in that context. And one thing that's kind of common in street protest in Kenya, but was really also seen in this, was the violence with which these protesters were met by the state. Security forces, Ruto's security forces were killed, injured, abducted, and tortured protesters for their protest activities. We'll talk much more about that in a bit. Whilst the finance bill was withdrawn on the 26th of June, many of the protest continues, as I said, until the 8th of August. And much happened also after that, which we'll also get into a bit. I include some pictures that were taken during the field work during this time. So when you see those, these are the pictures taken during the field work. A pivotal moment happened during these protests. That was on the 25th of June, 2024, and it was actually the anniversary yesterday, 2-year anniversary, where a group of protesters entered the fence around Parliament, broke across the fence around Parliament, and were met by security forces who shot them, killed several of them, injured even more, and it became a pivotal moment in these protests where Ruto went out on national TV, I think it was at 9 p.m. in the evening, and called protesters criminals, and that these acts of protest were treasonous. The diplomatic kind of international community responded and urged the Kenyan security forces to practice restraint during these periods. But what we also saw during this particular period, in addition to how they were met with violence in the streets, was also we saw a emergence of abductions of protesters, of activists for their presumed protest activities. To our knowledge, and based on data available, we had 82 abductions during the period, the last period in 2024, but then in the subsequent anniversary last year, had further 15 abductions. And during this period, this really emerged as a new, unprecedented security threat. That never before had we seen abductions being a threat to protesters in this way. And I just want to remind us all that whilst we talk about abductions, and we also spoke to people, I spoke to people who had been abducted, have survived their abduction, it's also just a reminder that many did not survive, and many are still missing as well. These were coordinated abductions. We don't have to believe us, I guess, but there were reports on this, how these were abductions that were carried out, organized by the national security units, such as intelligence services, military units, anti-terrorism units, and Directorate of Criminal Investigations that coordinate, organize these abductions. Okay, so that's the setting that I kind of, hopefully in a very broad sense, sketched out what it is. So what did we actually do? As Martin said, I do ethnography, so I like to go and spend time in the field, living with, immersing myself with, and in the settings that we study. One thing that's important is to say, and I want to just sketch out the setting. When we started this research, we did not know that this was going to happen. So it's kind of a weird thing to go and study protests, because almost kind of, which we didn't, by the way, start a protest to actually study it. But I have to remind myself that I'm history, so of course we did not. But it's this thing of being in place almost the wrong time or the right time. So what we kind of set out to do, as Martin kind of alluded to, was to introduce ethnography to cryptography. And ethnography is, I talk about the ethnography as a toolbox a lot, as most students will know, and there's a lot in this toolbox. So it's both data collection, so actually collecting whether it's interviews or observations, as we also did, and then we also analyze. A lot of the work that we do is also about analyzing the data to make sense of it and interpret what does it mean, because often, always actually, not just often, ethnographic data is messy and it's vast. So we're trying to make sense of it. So one thing that's key in the work that we do in particular is that we try to breach this, we bridge is the word, bridge the methodological gap in photography by introducing ethnography into it to establish realism, which is one of our central contributions of this work. So, and it is through this particular application of ethnography in cartography that we arrive at our security notions that Martin will talk about later. And I need to click over here. So one thing that we do, and this is something we talk a lot about in ethnography, we go and spend time with. Because specifically we talk about security questions, it's a difficult thing to talk about. It's like, what is your security? What does that even mean? So one thing ethnographers we do is we go and just hang out, even deep hang out, which means it's really engage, live with, spend time with over extended period of time. And these are again some pictures of some of the settings where I deep hung out, if that's the word to say, with people in the settings. Whether it's a street protest, which is in figure 4, or whether it was in the local community settings where we're also often doing placard making sessions or discussing the next protest. Specifically, what does this then look like? The two main methods within ethnographic work was active participant observation and ethnographic interviews, which I'll just come through in a second. But that meant, in our case, was that I spent time from, I think the start of June until mid-September 2024, and again in 2025. And during this time, I spent time in the protests, trying not to protest, but observe. And also during the 18th, 20th, and 25th, which is really 3 main protest days. And then joining, as I saw the pictures before, activist meetings, visiting injured protesters in hospital, going to community outreach events, arts-based activism, etc. So that is one of the different ways of engagement through ethnographic work. And through this, we capture data, often reflective notes, and also observational notes in terms of field notes. Then, as I briefly mentioned, so, and what's the active? I guess I should just introduce that. Why is it active and not passive participant observation, which you will also see in ethnographic work? And that is that you adopt specific roles in the setting, such as, you might in the security trainings, or I went actively and took part in the protest, or rather than standing back and not engaging with it. And one thing that ethnography, I think is important just to mention, is that we know that we're part of the social work, so we're not trying to design away our own influence, or not influence, but our own kind of relation to this field. So that I just wanted to briefly mention. And then interviews. So ethnographic interviews is slightly different from those of you who might be familiar with just like more user studies. Because ethnographic interviews really are often repeated, they're often built on trust relations over time, which you live with for months. So you also establish relationships with people. And one thing for our work in this particular piece of work that we are representing is because this was about abductions and torture, as we saw for the first time in this setting, it was also something that was really volatile and sensitive for people to talk about. And ethnographic issues, if it hadn't for the ethnographic work, we wouldn't have known who are those who have experienced being abducted. So it's actually by being in place over a long period of time, gaining trust, that we could even find ways of engaging, let alone understand, but first of all, identify and engage with those who survived their abductions. So, whilst numbers, I don't care so much about numbers, but let me give it to you, 77 interviews, 8 of whom have been abducted, and I'll give you some insights into that and those interviews as well in a second. And I guess one thing that is perhaps important also to mention is that because security, and especially in this particular moment, so as these abductions were becoming a threat, and we started to realize it, as a we in a broader sense, the interlocutors, realizing this, it was also a moment they were sharing their experiences or concerns, and risk was also particularly risky, if you will. So actually, I feel quite, I don't like the word privileged because I don't think that's the case, but the fact that they're willing to share their experiences in the moment this was happening, as their whole adversarial landscape was changing, I think is quite, it's not unique, then a special insight into this particular time period. And then one thing, of course, as I mentioned, not about only data collection, is also about analyzing and understanding. So ethnographic data is messy, as I mentioned. So a lot of time trying to understand, filtering, coding, recoding, reinterpreting, and then for particular importance in ethnographic is that we did not go to Kenya to find a new security notion or to study compromised security. That was the intention. That is something that emerged through the analysis of the data. So it was through that first analysis by the fieldworker, i.e. in this case, and then in conversation with the photographer, keep reflexively coming back to first my analysis, going to the photographer and saying, this is what I see, and then asking questions, and then going back to the data, and going back to the field setting, and thinking, how does this hold? And keep, like for months, going back and forth until we were certain in what we were seeing and what we were interpreting. So this kind of inductive, reflexive reasoning is something that is central both to ethnography as a practice, but especially also to the relationship that we have between ethnography and photography. And this takes time, it's expensive, you have to travel and live in these settings, but I would argue if this is the kind of depth and understanding you want, this is also then what is required. And then it is super rich and rewarding. So, with that said, this is what we did. Data collected, the analysis, bringing it to cryptography as a technique to really bring about or understand security as it exists and real as it is real, and it's not supposed to be any sense, so let's go with it. I want to then talk you through some of the findings. This focus here, of course, in our work is around the abductions that happened during this period. It doesn't mean that this was the only findings that, of course, emerged from this work, but this is one part of what we focus on in our analysis. So, yes, abductions, which I've mentioned a few times now. So let's have a look at what they look like. So through this analysis that I mentioned, one thing that became increasingly clear was that these abductions were followed a particular pattern. In this particular period of time, it's changed later. The motivations for them are still continuing, but that has changed. But for this particular period of time, we still have abductions follow the pattern, but also how protesters, activists made sense of what they were experiencing, what their comrades were experiencing, and then tried to change their practices or modify their practices and their security outlook to meet that new threat environment. And then they found ways of trying to protect themselves during abductions, and this is what we'll just go through now, these phases. So, as I mentioned, this was a new threat, should look over here, where even for, there we go. So during this period, because it was new, they were also scrambling for ways, interlocutors were scrambling for ways in which they could try to protect themselves. And one thing we saw was we need to stick together. So the collective sense of security that was already there within activist groups and protest networks really was heightened during this period. So it meant that people would move in groups, and when they went outside, they'd often move in with family or friends for a period, keep moving because they were being targeted, would have a body system established, so really seeing how practices that were there in some way really became heightened and also became more pronounced during this period. Some would start carrying a second clean phone, and others would also use other people's ID to try and hide their own identity, depending on their situation. And even for those who did, they thought everything they could once they realized they were being targeted, because what we saw during this period was those who were conceived of or seen by the security forces as being leaders or leading organizers have a specific a leading role in organizing the protests were being targeted. And they often saw this by having someone telling them you need to go into hiding because I've heard this and this and this, or they would have cars surrounding their offices where they were and realized, okay, I need to go into hiding. And as P37 says here, I was completely in hiding where they still found them. And what this was that even they stopped using WhatsApp, they stopped using mobile money, mobile payment, which is heavily used in Kenya. They still found them. So even they was completely in hiding, and they still found me. And what we then saw, so I said the thing about there being a pattern, and what the pattern was, there was a capture. So where the abducted individuals would be captured, which is the part right here, and then they would be taken to a place where they were being interrogated. But in terms of the capture, what we particularly noticed in our analysis was that they were often between 4 and 8 masked individuals who were confident, often under the cover of darkness, and they would beat them until at least try to get them to open and unlock their phones. All their devices would be taken. P22, I haven't got it here, I'll come in a second, but some tried to resist and refuse, but eventually everyone gave them access to their devices. They had their phones taken, asked to unlock, and then they were shoved into one of the vehicles of their abductors, and then they were taken to an unknown location. They had their hands tied behind their back and they were blindfolded. So that is roughly the content of the capture. And I won't read this quote out in full because I'm realizing I'm also talking my time. So, but here P22 really summarizes the experience of that moment of capture that I just summarized before, that it's breaking in, cover darkness. They went for my phone, they beat me, I refused, P22 refused, was one of the first to be abducted, so had nothing to kind of go by, how this is going to go, but refused to give them access to their phone. P22 later did during interrogations, but this moment did not know what they were being susceptible to, as they were the first to be abducted. And what we then see, once after the abductions, abducted individuals being captured and were taken to a house, as many explain, left on the floor of the room, even a mattress or on a concrete floor, and they would then be instantly taken to an interrogation room, handed over to interrogators. And it is through this period, some were also taken just in the car and were taken to the interrogation room, the same for the P60 there. But what we see is that they were asked to unlock their phone, and this repeats across our data, that the abductors wanted access to their phones. They wanted to look through their messaging, so what role they played in organizing of the protests, and they wanted to look at their mobile money. So they wanted to look at where is finance coming from. And this became a recurring question throughout these protests, is that who is funding you to do this from the security forces? Why are you doing it? Who is leading it? Who are you? And that was a motivating factor behind these abductions. And we see that in some of the questions as well, but also in terms of how they were forced, as P6 is also suggesting here, or saying here, so how they were forced to unlock their devices. I want to read this one out because I think it's quite key to understand the transition to what we're going to talk about in a bit. So I talked about how, in very brief terms, in terms of the capture and the interrogation and the violence with which those who were abducted were forced to comply with the requests of their abductors and the interrogators. So one thing that had been established in arrests in particular was really important to make it known that you were being taken, so that an alarm system could sound. And what I want to read out P51's experience, because I think that is worth kind of pausing on. So P51 was taken, one of the first of these protests to be taken, was in the abductor's car, taken to the booth, and the phone had been taken. And then P51 shares with me in a 4-hour interview, very brief message, hey, I'm being abducted, I don't know where I am. After I texted him, he took the screenshot, that's of the message, and posted it on X. So that is how it spread. Funnily enough, after like 30 minutes or so, and as the abductors were driving me around, the car stopped again. And then they came out, they opened the trunk, and then they started beating me up. And then they asked me, where is that phone? So they knew that I had it on the phone because my friend shared my screenshot. I think that is the only thing that saved me. Because if it wasn't for that message, these guys had another motive. Because nobody was aware of my abductions apart from that one message. So they could have killed me and taken me somewhere. Nobody could have known. So the fact that I was now out saved me. Yeah? So this thing of like being out, and so that shouting could start. And this is something that was kind of revelation to us as many of these findings are, but this thing of actually, it worked. For those who managed to shout, to get the word out, I have been taken, those are the ones who we also survived. Of course, others survived too, but the ones we spoke to had managed to somehow shout, or at least get the word out. Because what we saw during these protests was that getting the message out to the trusted comrades meant that this could be shouted across specifically X, which is prominently used by actors in Kenya, and that put pressure on the security group, on the abductors. So it created a feedback loop back to the abductors who then realize, okay, we need to do something here. And often they dump them, either try to offload on the police station, often they didn't want, the police stations didn't want them, or they dump them in a river or isolated location. But this idea that getting the message out, as he said, that one message saves them, and then so shouting, as you can see here, these posters are some of the ones who were abducted, who were shouting, was initiated, and was inverted commas successful, even about success in this setting. And so I think it's part of like it being a feedback loop, and actually this stopped, or at least hindered some of the violence in this situation. So I think that I will leave it there. Maybe the last thing I'll just say before I leave it up to Martin, not leave it up to Martin, but hand over to Martin, is to say that, of course, I've talked about this as being something that was carried out during this kind of abduction, and it was, but they also, some of these practices were established within activist networks across Kenyan activist groups. So the building blocks, if you will, were there. This idea of informing others during arrests was part of the network structure, but the abductions, of course, changed this setting. But I'll leave it. Yeah.
Right, moving on. So this brings us to uncompromised violence, which is a security notion that we identified in this data. And so what it means informally is when taken, abducted persons can alert a network without the person notice. And so like that's like roughly kind of what we learned from this data. What you want to get the word out, but like you need to get the word out, right? So like it's the adversary mustn't be able to prevent you from getting the word out, right? So in the case of the 51, they realized the message had gotten out what was to say, right? They're shouting it over. So that's the security goal that we're trying to do, yes. So, and now kind of like our task was, okay, like can we do this, right? And so let's try to formalize this, and so we kind of formalize this in a protocol, so that's an object we can reason about. And so I'm going to give you all the simplified syntax. The main thing will then be the actual security notion. It's going to be a game that's both kind of like, realizes the title of this talk, but also is a claim about this game. That's the main methodological contributions. So what we do is we have a protocol between the client and the server, right? So the client is the person who's potentially abducted, or more specifically their phone, and the server could be just a comrade, or it could be like a server run by, like, say, non-government organizations. And so we have some setup. The client inputs some key. This is like some encryption material, right? So this encapsulates that kind of the adversary is after confidential information, so protected by the key, and then a personal secret. I will talk more about this. The client message, the server has the processing of the client message, and afterwards the server has a state and the client has a state, right? So device state, client service. It's pretty standard cryptographic pair. And then after the setup phase, we have a usual request response kind of protocol. So we have the device state, so that is again the phone, and then there's a personal secret that produces the client message, which goes over to the server, which then processes it based on the state, and outputs a server message, and it detects that. The server message goes back to the client, and the client can then use this server message together with their device state to recover this key. Right? So the whole thing is built around this idea. There's a key that protects some confidential information, and you need to have some interaction in order to recover the key and thus have access to the confidential information. Okay, and then I have some assurance that most people in this room have seen cryptographic games before. So hopefully this isn't quite too surprising to you. So for those of you who haven't seen cryptographic games before, this is what a true cryptographer like a thing is, right? So when we say like, what is a secure encryption scheme, what is this game? And so there's other paradigms for the purposes of this talk. Let's just stick to game-based notation. Okay, and so we have this security notion, key distinguishability, which is roughly what captures confidentiality for us. and then add compromise blindness. And so in this game, I'm going to walk you through the left side of this game a little bit, but on the right side, what we essentially have is, in the game, we need to specify what can the adversary do, and we give it access to run the protocols. Right? So there's nothing too surprising going on the right side of the thing. There are requests and responses, there's a get key function, there's a request and response thing, and there's a clear function that we need for some technical reasons, and that's essentially the adversary can schedule all of this happening and nothing should run. That's what we do. So let's talk about the left-hand side of this game. Because what we think is so this work has two legs, if you like, or two pillars, or there's two things. On the one hand, we study at compromise security, and on the other hand, we're also trying to address the criticism of chat that I started, right? And so what we do in our work is we explicitly write this out as a claim. And so in particular, we say here's this game, and we claim this game is real. Right, so this game doesn't just fall from the sky, it isn't just our intuition that made up this game, but we say this game correctly models a security need that actually existed. And as Rikke has insisted, ethnography is about the micro, the specific, so we cannot make any claims that are generalized to any other setting whatsoever, but we can make a claim this, that's the end, right? So that's the contribution. And then we go through and say, each line in the game that isn't there for bookkeeping, that is motivated by cryptography, we tell you why it's there. This is there for this reason in this game. And I'm going to give you a sketch of this. So first, let's start. Our game starts with sampling some keys 1 that you can think of the real person's secret. So think of this as a pin code for simplicity. Right, so, and we're modeling this as some distribution because pin codes are random, they have no entropy, and so on. Right, so we need to take that into account. And then we sample PS0, which is some other pin code, and it's the only requirement is it is not the real pin code. Right, so any. And then what we have is we have this request response, and what we rely on is on the one hand this low entropy person secret, but on the other hand the device state. The device state can store some cryptographic secrets, so against third parties who haven't compromised the device, we can have some cryptographic guarantees. But the only thing that we then have once the device has been compromised is the person's secret. And here, the key first thing observation is, those of you who know post-compromise security, it tries to hear from a compromise, but it doesn't distinguish between detectable and undetectable compromise. And what we have here is at least one person who knows that any compromise, right? The person being taken. So, and they get to choose what pin they're going to pull out, right? They're doing this under distress, but there's a thing, the adversary doesn't immediately have to. So the first thing is to model this distinction between devices and the people who have. And indeed, the person who's been taken, they know they've been abducted, so they can decide which pin they want to give to the person, right? So unlock your phone, and then there is a choice between which pin you want to enter, and you shouldn't really think about unlocking your phone because the protocol we're designing will go horribly wrong. If then you have few types of the wrong pin on your phone, you can hide that behind the phone pin, and then you have right? But it's okay. And then what we do is first we want confidentiality, right? So the adversary wants to know who's financing, who's organizing the terrorists. And it is information that the people who are being taken maybe want to protect, right? So there is a security goal of confidentiality. And so we model this as this key distinguishability. Is this the real key or wrong key? So we compose it with a favorite confidentiality notion. And we're saying if you break confidentiality, the key distinguishability bit, then you must have at least sent one client message out. Right, so what we're saying here is, so there was the funding. So what we're saying is yes, the adversary can win the distinguishing game, but only if a message was sent to the server. Right, that's the condition. So it shouldn't be hard without such a message to break confidentiality, because then there's nothing we can do. So that's this one message safety we want to enforce if confidentiality is broken, because confidentiality was broken in every single case that we saw here. if confidentiality is broken, at least one message got out to the server. And that's the requirement. And then the next step is the alert. And so this is where the second person secret comes in. Here, this is modeling that somehow someone outside, not under the control of the university, knows that something has gone wrong. Right? Like this alert kind of thing. And what we model here is that any secret which isn't the initial secret, the real secret, will trigger an alert. And there's many reasons why it's any secret, and then preempt your question that you're going to be asking, why not just one distress signal instead of one, is because then the university needs to entirely. So it needs to be any personal secret, any secret which isn't the initial personal secret must trigger an alarm. We can generalize this slightly, we can discuss about this. And so what happens when this happens, so if we give the wrong secret and the message has been received and the adversary somehow manages that the server doesn't trigger the attack and the other side does not realize something has gone wrong, then the adversary wins. So that's what we want to do. Right? So we want this to be, want to make sure that if we give the wrong pin, then an alarm is in place. Okay, and then the last thing is blindness, what we're trying to achieve, and that is the adversary shouldn't know whether we gave it the real or the bad. And the key thing is that what we do is that it does not matter which pin you provide to the server to recover the correct decryption key. So whether you can decrypt or not does not depend on the pin that you entered. And the reason for that is to maintain blindness. What we care about is that the adversary does not notice that you're not cooperating with them until it's too late for the adversary, right? Until people out there know. So that is so the key goal is to get the alert out because confidentiality is lost. So that's why the get key function unconditionally will return the correct key. Because we only care about raising the alert and we don't want to endanger people by saying like, I see you gave me the wrong pin, you're dead. And this is really a critical thing to observe, right? So we're starting with a game where we want to protect confidentiality, and we're giving up confidentiality so that an alert can go out. And this is perhaps a security notion that is very unintuitive to you if you're a trained photographer, right? Because like confidentiality is very high up there as probably the #1 security goal you have. But, and again, we're not making any claims that it's generalized, and what we're saying is like, in this setting, that's how we save lives. Okay. I then kind of just want to say, so like I focus here on the game, right? And so like roughly what I've just done is also what is written out under this claim, right? And that's our methodological contribution. We encourage other cartographers to also argue about why the game is real. And then we, of course, also do the standard stuff of showing the notions. We give a construction and then we go secure. It's already fairly straightforward how you can achieve this with some equivalencies and registering AAD. Okay, I have to
Thanks. Yeah, so as I guess the slide not only suggests, but tells us it's like last thoughts, which means I shouldn't just now ramble for another half an hour, I guess. So, last thoughts. I started with this as well, where I said that, of course, not all those who were abducted made it out of capture alive. So I want to just read a note that, so FM5 is a field note, so I said that interviews, of course, transcripts and notes, but also a lot of this is captured in field notes from the ethnographer, and in this case me. So in July 2024, the picture is from a dump site in one of the slums where the local residents started to find bodies, 42 bodies, and they were retrieving these bodies themselves. So So during this period, I wrote in my field notes, over the weekend, 5 brothers were retrieved from swamps and quarries. People had been missing since the first protest, and most with bullet wounds. Bodies of missing protesters also been found in some parks. So I don't want to say more about that, I just wanted to highlight it because whilst we can of course come with some technological, if not, technological solutions, but at least some underpinnings of that, I just find it important to remind ourselves of some of these contexts. A lot of the things that we also do as ethnographers, which is really important to our work, that ethnography has a really murky history of being extractivist, of taking data away. So one thing is really important for the work that we do, but also more broadly for modern ethnography, is to do reciprocity. And we do it in many different ways. We also discuss this security notion with interlocutors in Kenya to get their feedback and trying to see where we were missing the point, if we were, which is also reflected in what Martin just talked about. And then also one thing that we did both in Nairobi, where I spent most of my time, but also in Mombasa and Kisumu, was to do ground up security. I don't like to call them trainings, but one day kind of engagements around security in the setting for this particular moment. What should we consider? How you might protect yourself? So we did that as well during the field work and continue to have those conversations. So that is it. And of course, if you want to see more about our work more broadly on the Social Foundations of Cryptography project, which includes, well, the Kenya work, but also ethnographer working in Uganda, the Philippines, and Brazil and Hungary as well. We're trying to establish some of these, what security looks like and means in these settings. So check it out. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for the talk and for doing this work. Do we have questions?
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. You mentioned, you're going outside into these communities, at least initially, were under attack, in a sense.
No, I'm sorry, under attack.
And well, also, maybe crazy things on.
No, I was thinking.
Yeah, that's
cool.
In those contexts, do you find it extra hard to get to talk about security, or are they about equally happy to talk about security if there are other sort of methods?
Thank you for that. That's a really good question. I find security is a difficult one to talk about full stop because often when we see security studies being done, it's often with people who think of themselves as quite security conscious and already have an idea that I know what security looks like. So getting people who don't feel secure in what they do is actually quite hard. So you build that trust over time. I think one thing, and this is not something I thought I would really say, is that because it was such a volatile moment where they couldn't almost really sometimes trust people in other groups because people were turning, given the heightened security or insecurity at the moment, being someone from the outside, and also just, as you might notice, I don't blend in, I mean, let's be real. So also that was really, and actually having this, it was really important for them that this didn't stay within Kenya, and it was actually something that we talked about broadly. So I almost think, because of such a big moment, security almost came to us before we started talking about other methods. So, but I think it's an important point, because my answer would usually be straight up, yes, it's hard, but I think this was a particular setting. Did I answer your question? Okay, cool, thank you.
Maybe while we're walking, how did you actually come to the motions? Like, was there a feedback group, or was it essentially you provided input and then the photographers came up with,
You think I would just let them come up with, like, yeah, this is clearly, oh God, what's it?
Oh, okay. So This is technically prepared. So like, you know, like presented like some initial findings and analysis results with us, and we did what we cryptographers do, right? We speculated, like, oh, you know, and then like and then back to the drawing board, and there was this iterative process, right? So I think it's a really important, like, when we report on the but like it's really important to do this where both sides are very confident in their own science, right? So like it's really important to do this, like for us photographers, we could really speculate because we knew we would be told like no, like the data just doesn't allow this, like this is wrong, right? Let's say it wasn't like, oh, maybe we can touch it or something, and then the same way it was also kind of like, you know, we can like I think there's a thing here, but like, you know, like I don't know, it's like, but like, you know, you go, and I think it's sort of like they're very separate in our own disciplines, and then came together, and then it's like no one was like let's meet in the middle, but like I would not meet in the middle. Like no, you don't compromise to the data. Like, I don't think kind of say through to it doesn't. So it's a lot of back and forth, and I don't want to say adversarial, but like almost that's what we want. Right? So because then in that attention, you kind of like produce the results.
Yeah, so maybe a bit of a different question. But I was heard stories on like dark meters on the phone, and one peak code they like unlock the hard code, and one peak code is the safe version. So if they come like from police, they would unlock the safe version, which is bad or something. Did you consider that, or was it like integrity to data?
We did, of course, consider that. The problem is, as one of the examples that Rikke gave, is like the targets of productions, like they were under surveillance, right? So, yes, that is the version. So, like we personally knew a lot about them. So, your problem wasn't the technology of like what is the take, like, you know, like do I have the technology to reveal partial data or like fake data? You just didn't know what data to present to the university that the university would find convincing. So there was a lot of like, you know, like once they targeted you for adoption, like they thought they knew a lot about you, your networks and so on. So like it just wasn't an option.
Maybe just to add to that, so P37, which I briefly brought in, is P37 knew, and the doctors told them that they had trailed them for a week beforehand to actually learn everything about them. And then only when they got the order from above, did they then take them. So there's this, and also the unit is involved in the monitoring of their communications in the lead up to adoptions. And beyond the fact that they actually just, one thing that we sometimes forget, I guess, when we talk about more information security, cyber or digital, whatever we like to call it on the day, is that people also live next door to each other. You know, these many of these will be some areas where the only thing that separates you is like sheet of metal. So people also just the adversary knows a lot about you in this setting.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It's very inspiring. I have a question regarding the design of the security game. Did you assume that the adversary has the knowledge of the game? Or?
Yeah, it's worse. We must educate the adversary about the game, not the game, but the security notion. So the problem, like, so, and this is such a, so what we're trying to do here is design cryptography in the presence of violence. And that is not really fit for a cryptographic game, because in a cryptographic game, what we're saying is like, it doesn't matter what the adversary throws at us, they don't succeed. But our security goal is to make the attack stop. Right? So like, we don't want the adversary to succeed, but like, we want the violence to stop, right? And for that, we need to convince the adversary that it's futile. And so in particular, when it comes to, yes, the adversary, you need to, like, connectivity is a big issue, right? And so the adversary, you need to allow this message to go out, and then it can decrypt. There is no meeting that will allow you to decrypt this message without this message going out. And so you would need to, if you want to actually deploy this, the reasons why you wouldn't want to deploy this in Kenya now, the situation has changed. But like, if you want to deploy this, you almost want to put up posters outside of police stations, informing them, like, this is our new app, and it has this security feature. So we need not just we have to assume the university knows the technology, the mechanism, but we need to actively educate the university about it.
Maybe I missed it. I was wondering, the active person is often doing a paycode triggering and starting to obviously. Together with the payload is also the location being revealed in certain other metadata, like for instance sites and those kind of things.
So we could of course attach that. We could say, but like, we don't do this because we assume the complete device is under the university's control, so we wouldn't have reliable data for this. But as a best effort, it was like we really we didn't want to step out of like this is like the worst case university's attacker model. But I think if you actually look at like you can always do a best effort, right? So and then there's a lot of things that you can do of maybe what you're actually reading is not the location data, but maybe a key now that reveals the location data that has been uploaded before. There's all kinds of things that you can do to strengthen like the information that you have about the person being abducted. For now, we just like the fact set detect, because that's the thing that we can rely on.
But also in the Kenyan setting, this is what we're specifically focusing on and wrapping ourselves in, is that in the Kenyan setting, they have this, they have a system of alerting during arrest. And, one of the interlocutors knew that comrades will be there, right? So they knew after the first abductions in P22, they knew that it was clear that the passenger was there, and then it got too hot for the doctors because it wasn't inside the books, it was like outside of what they're supposed to do. It was that actually they were trying to offload them. So I think you don't even need to, so where they were at that moment, I think for them it was just that they knew they would be dumped somewhere and their comments would be there. But yes, the same thing for soldiers. It's a question we had about you.
Thanks. Did at any point you were either endanger you or like the people that analysts, like nice, like I can imagine like if you take like notes and so on, that certainly knows about learn about you, they will pay extra attention to you. That happened.
Thank you for that question. That's an important question. So I really don't care as much about danger to me. But I can say a little bit about that and then specifically talk about interlocutors. So I think, so go through practice and risk assessments, of course, and the ironic thing with here that we did not know that these were the processes that were happening. I was going to study other annual protests that are a bit peaceful in inverted commas, but then it's happened. So of course, they endanger in terms of, so everything changed on the 15th when we were announced, so we have the 18th of June protest. So you are in the protest setting where the adversary uses physical violence from the get-go. There was tear gas, or whether it was live ammunition, or whether it was beatings, and water cannons with paint. So that is, of course, something that you, in the moment, I think is you might think of this as secure or safe. But I think your interesting part of your question is what to do to the local, what to do to what extent do I might precedent draw attention to the interlocutors and those that we engage with, which I think is a really important question. So I mentioned what we did, but the first thing started with having a conversation probably 6 months before I actually went to Kenya with the group that I ended up engaging with. First of all, can I come out and meet you? So I spent 2 weeks initially in April 24, and one of the key questions was, would me being there put you at risk? So for example, and I don't know whether I'll say this on the, maybe I should say this I'll say this on the live stream or recording, but we put in some measures, the things that we did not do, that we would buy the books, we probably should have done, to protect them. And I can just tell you offline what that was. But, and then one thing that came back was saying, no, you don't, your presence almost protects us because you look like you do. So I was like, yeah, I was like, this one's down now, like this, yeah. In Visa, they're like, no, because they're not going to want to shoot you. That's going to be a nightmare for them. So if you were there, I would say that was not how it played out, because on the first day of the protest, they basically captured all the international press corps, which I've been told if I just pretended to be press, I'll be safe. But then when I saw that, I ran. But yeah, that was the answer to your question, that actually from their perspective, it was actually more of a protection. But I think, yeah, I can talk more about it on the rumble, but I can tell you.
Thank you for this important work, and it's really good you guys are doing. And I'm curious, I have more questions I could possibly ask in the time allotted. But I wanted to know about the trainings that you did. I see you did in that field there out of the country. And I wonder if any of the people that you're looking to provide, is any of those people who have trained, and what kind of psychological support you have to be depressed and get involved in this after, even if your people were not in the trash field.
Yeah, it's a lot. Okay, so first in terms of training, it's very much specifically around security training. So I don't pretend to be able to train anyone really, even though I'm not a student, so that's it. But in terms of training, that's why I hesitate to call it training, but it's really about, what is metadata, what is the difference in metadata and content or access control. It was actually, and I think the thing about in situ, being on the ground, understanding the environment that you are trying to speak to people about is really important. So I didn't do the trainings on day one. It was like in the third month, right? Because I think you really need to ground yourself and understand what are the concerns and threats, and also protection mechanisms that already exist in this setting. Who am I to go in and say, no, this is security, use signal, when you don't have data? I mean, that doesn't make sense, right? So you really have to ground yourself. So all of this was grounded in the setting. That's why I said I went to outside, I did some sessions, and consumer Nairobi. So that was really important. On the psychological side, I'm going to say whether any of the ones who attended any of those workshops, we call it that, were amongst those who were dumped, but I'm not a psychologist, or I don't do that. One thing of being an laboratory is that you also just listen to people. That has nothing to do with security and just being present. And one thing that's important for our work, yes, security notions, but what is just for interesting, like, well, that's how the options are done. And that was much more useful for them, for us to feedback. It was like, we now understand the mechanisms of the others and what they were doing, rather than actually the security notion we found fascinating.
Maybe, and just like me, no photographer was in the field. There was a clear methodological decision, you will not expose interlocutors to these people. But what I'm trying to follow up is, like, in some sense, it's also like a bit of a tension here, right? So when you hear, like, you talk about like finding excitement in some sense, like you kind of like actually, it's probably one of the most detailed accounts of these productions in our paper, right? It's a bureau, and so it's a bit of a bizarre situation to be in. And the data is extremely rich, right? And then we give you again. There's also something like not right about this approach, right? So in some sense, like, we think it's a really useful contribution to photography, to ask ourselves these games, like they fall from the sky, and like how do we actually establish the realism that's right for photography? But then, you know, like on the other hand, you really don't want to reduce kind of like these settings, kind of like the stories, these reports, like the richness of these findings. So like, is that something for photography? Maybe for like the border audience here, they cryptographic training. There's a lot of system security, right? It's a lot of devices, right? And if you start assuming TE, there's a lot you can do, right? But like, we are not going to do that, right? So there's also like a limitation in the design of projects, right? And I think this probably going to be sort of iteration here for like how do you do this right so that you can really do justice in commerce to like the data that we have and the people who give you their trust, right? And it's also a bit weird, like we were doing this, like now we're in a game. Like, it's useful, I think we did this okay work that we did, right? But there's still something weird here.
But we also didn't look for something for cryptography, right? I think that's perhaps also an important thing. It's not that we always been very clear in the broader projects, social foundations of cryptography, that as ethnographers, we're not going to go into the fields and look for things for cryptographers. But we enter the field, we go in, I'm also in security, so of course I have a security somewhat, whatever happened. But we want to engage the field as it exists. And if there's nothing there, it's easy cryptography, so be it. Then we have also the cool stuff we can do. We don't need the cryptographic output of that. But yeah, for this particular thing, I think that's really useful thing to do.
Okay, I would say one last question, then we go to a coffee break. If there are any questions.
Did you also think of other types of security in place? So you know there's a group of people going to a place. So there's people on a phone, they can all be connected by Bluetooth, whatever. And then if one of them doesn't come back to a certain place, you can assume that that person is abducted and do exactly the same thing without having to go through all the stuff of hiding, etc. So basically, like you go in pairs and one of them doesn't come back, you know something happened to the other one, you can also make it present that something happened to them, because that's basically what was pointed at. So it's better.
Yes, we have in an appendix of the full version, we have what we call as like the zero message protocol. It's actually going to function, but how do you send the stress signal or the absence of a message is stress. And that would mirror kind of standard practices of checking protocols, right? So we meet there at 6 p.m., those who don't show up, we assume they can take it, right? The problem with that is you need to make stronger assumptions to do this online, because like connectivity is really integrated. And so you then, it's very trivial, you know, assume the first tree that controls the network, then it's really difficult to kind of have this without being overwhelmed by all the sources. So you kind of wrote it down, like it's also a game, like it's essentially an unfortunate game in the end. It's really, so we have it in there, but we kind of figure out that this one has fewer assumptions on the anniversary, but different settings might work.
In a more physical way, not in terms of people bugging up in pairs as well as, you know, one can come back. But many of these interactions happen, you know, and they're on their own, preemptively, you know, in undercover environments. So this thing of policy being taken and there's some present often. So that's an important addition to that mindset.
You can find something different for us, for example. Also, the security rules to be shipped. I saw that kind of doing of questions of the new thing, like the new threat that we were worried about. So it was first, like, you're arrested and like maybe how do you think about confidentiality and getting an alert out, like, it's different, right? Because the level of violence is, you know, it's still violence, but like, the level of violence is still different. It's like people tend to come back when they're arrested and abducted persons.